I'm trying to use a lapel mic because I talk with my hands a lot, so it's not a good idea having a mic in my hand. Kaya, hello. The actual title of this this presentation is how to make artwork with no money when you don't know what you're doing. Because my background is as originally a theatre technician. I trained as a set builder and props maker, and then went back to art school thinking I would be a sculptor and painter, and the first 6 weeks of art school totally blew that out of the water. So I now work in that weird domain that no one has a name for, so they call it emerging and experimental art forms. So what I'm going to be talking about today is specifically how I work with collaboration as a strategic methodology. And I was going to start in a place that I thought I was organised on with my presentation, and then we did all this work this morning, and I've gone, no, I'm going to start from, I got to work with a really fantastic little group of people. We were group 4 for Yabini's exercise, and we got virtual reality and mirrors. And what we talked about in that 1 minute didn't even touch on all of the kind of ideas and the meta ideas that we were playing with around what does it mean to... I'm terrible with tech, so, yep.
One second.
Yep. That's okay. I can, yep. I mean, if you can hear me, I'm just going to keep talking because that's what I do really well. So we talked about what are mirrors? Why do we have mirrors? What's going on with mirrors? What goes on when we shift from the actual physical entity of an object that reflects light to a virtual entity that uses digital technology to reflect us back to us? What's going on behind the mirror? So there was a whole set of conversations, and this is what I love about working collaboratively, is that we were bouncing ideas off each other around what's the problem we're trying to solve. And there were many different kind of problems that come up around this, but one of the really fundamental problems, it's fine. I'm just going to keep talking because that's what I do.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
Thanks.
One of the fundamental problems, and it's true of mirrors and it's true of technology, I think, is that the problem isn't necessarily the technology. It's not the mirror or the virtual mirror. It's the socio-cultural context for mirrors. Why do we have them? Why do we use them? And we went down this rabbit hole, and at one point Axolotl mentioned the old Snow White fairy story in the context of beauty and beauty myths, in terms of the mirror speaking back to Snow White. And my tiny little artist brain went, oh my God, we've got to remember what's going on behind the mirror. And behind the mirror are people. So what if we could create a hack that meant that when you opened your virtual mirror and you said a word 3 times backwards, you know that old myth, the old wives' tale, you stand in front of the mirror, you say Satan backwards 3 times and Satan comes out of the mirror? What if we could create a hack where you say a word, a name, Bezos, Musk, you say it backwards 3 times, and all of a sudden the mirror drops away and it reveals what's behind the mirror, what's going on with all that data, what's going on, how is it being used? So the moral of that story, the very short moral of that story is never underestimate the power of collaborative, creative thinking to take you to places you didn't expect to go. And that's where I want to start from. So I'm going to somehow chuck that. I'm really bad with tech. Got it. That's where I'm starting from. So as I mentioned, my background is in theatre. I trained at Whopper as a set builder and props maker, and because of that background, I've always worked collaboratively. I've always worked as part of collaborative teams. For me, there's a real value in working as part of a collaborative team. In terms of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It always is. You're always going to get more from working collaboratively. And on good days, you move forward exponentially. On bad days, you just hate those other people, But in a world that's highly individualistic, my sense is that there's a real strategic power in working collectively. And there's a whole lot of other layers to that I'm going to talk about. particularly in context of the work that I've been developing over the last 3 or 4 years, as an offshoot to a whole series of queer kinship projects that I've been working on over the last 8 years. I'm just going to read this bit because when I was reflecting on what working collaboratively, what value I get from working collaboratively, this was what I came up with. So I get a lot of value out of making with others. I can see how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts plays out. I learn a lot about myself, and I learn a lot about others from working collaboratively. Critically over the years, I've learned how to listen and observe across differences and barriers. And we don't live in a world that's particularly good at that anymore. I've learned how to build bridges and to cross divides, how to hold ground for what is important to me, and also how to hold ground for others who don't usually get to be heard. And I've seen the power that collective creative action has to change the world. So don't ever underestimate what art can do and what art can do when you make it collectively. At the moment I'm talking about art, the experience of making art. I'm not talking about immersive technologies, mostly because I'm a total Luddite when it comes to those technologies, which you're going to learn along the way. So, second part of why I work collaboratively is that I'm a big old queer. Don't know if you picked that up. I came out at 19, came out again recently, so I came out at 19 as a dyke, I came out again recently as non-binary. It's a continuous and ongoing process, and it happens in relation to other people. So my early queer life was very much informed by collective action and working collectively with queer folk. And one of the things that I've loved in the 40 years now that I've been out and been involved in queer activism is that queer activism comes with a particular cultural flavour, and that's lots of colour and movement. It's a really potent mix of getting out there and being visible on the streets, but it does come with a caveat, which is just because I'm dancing doesn't mean I'm not angry. Yeah, okay, so that's me in the background with the shaved head. I'm about 26 years old in the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. So I spent years working as an artist and then as the workshop manager with the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. I sat on many different committees, and I got to be actively involved and participate with a whole range of different people making art that made changes. Sorry, I'm croaky. Okay, so for me, there's 3 arms of collaboration. When I sit down and I break it down, there's a community element to my collaborations. I like working with my communities. I like learning about them. I like learning from them, and I like contributing to them. There's institutional or organisational collaborations that I have, and one in particular I'm going to be talking about today, which is the support that I've had from PICA with my queer kinship projects. And then there's the creative and technical collaborations that I have. So over the 15 years or so that I've been practicing as an artist, I take a great deal of pleasure out of working with other artists, and often those artists are experts in their own right, technically. So just going to give you a couple of examples of pre-augmented reality collaborative artworks. So this is an artwork that spanned about 3 years. Just got to check the dates, 2015 to 2017. So I was approached by the lovely Goklim Pigeon to create an artwork for Sculpture by the Sea, which would be a floating house made from other people's rubbish. So Goklim came to me because we'd worked together to create some housing for him when he was homeless. Sorry, when they were homeless. Sorry for misgendering you. And we built a yurt that Goklim could live in. And following on from that, it was a collaboration between their investment and their creative ideas around how do we tackle the problem of homelessness when housing and homes is very much tied to a market model and a capitalist model. So Goklim approached me with the idea of going to Sculpture by the Sea and creating a floating artwork that Goklim could live on, engage in some performative activities with community coming down there. So over a period of about 6 months, with the help and support of Fremantle Arts Centre, we started collecting rubbish, and I designed and built a raft. We got to a certain point with Sculpture by the Sea where it was an interesting journey with them, where it was gradually becoming more and more apparent that they really didn't want us to do this thing. But they didn't have a way of saying, we don't want you to do this thing, we don't want you to be part of what we're doing. So they kept on throwing barriers up in our way, and I don't think they realised it's not a great idea to push back against a queer activist, because you say no and I'm just going to go, nah, fuck you. So I found other collaborating partners to work with. I went out and through my networks found a lovely couple of seafaring experts by the name of Kim Clarker. He's a naval architect, and Tom Bosma, a marine archaeologist, and they helped me overcome the engineering problems, the challenges that Sculpture by the Sea were putting up. We also realised that we were going to have a real problem taking the raft from Fremantle Arts Centre and finding a place to launch it, and through Tom and Kim I connected with Fremantle Sailing Club. Never thought I'd be so immersed in a white middle class institution, but they were really willing to come on board and help, and they helped with the final assembly with volunteers from their sailing club, and they got the raft into the water for us. Problem was, at that stage, Sculpture by the Sea threw up the final obstacle, which is you cannot have this on the water. We won't allow you to have it on the water. There were a whole lot of reasons, marine exclusion zones and all sorts of other reasons. And the best they were going to offer us was that it could be on the beach, and Goklim could perform whatever they were going to perform, but they'd do it on the beach. And at that point, Goklim and I went, well, that's completely counterintuitive to the point of building this raft. So we pulled out of Sculpture by the Sea, and by that time Goklim was pretty burnt out, so they stepped back and I was left with a raft and nothing to do with it. Didn't know what to do with it. It was living down at Fremantle Sailing Club. So I put out the call to my artist networks and said, who wants to come and work with me and come up with something for this raft? And a bunch of artists, just going to read out their names: Devon Ward, Elizabeth Pedler, Lauren Cronenmeyer, Matt Aiken, I don't know if you know some of those names, came on board, and we formed a collaborative. We formed the Raft Collaborative, and we came up with this ridiculous plan to have the raft on the Swan River for 6 months, travelling from Fremantle all the way down all the way up the river to Elizabeth Quay. And at certain strategic locations along the way, mostly related to sailing clubs, the ones that I could persuade to come on board, we moored the raft up, and it operated in those places as a floating art space for a month at a time. This is raft at Elizabeth Quay. Can't tell you how many complaints we had about that piece of shit that was floating in the water. Such a pleasure. The little crew from Tone List performing there, we showed videos and so on. It came out of the water after 6 months, and it was one of the most scary things I've ever seen. When it went on the crane at Royal Perth Yacht Club and they lifted it out, the whole thing was going like this, because it wasn't designed to be on the water for any longer than 2 weeks. So the fact that it had survived 6 months on the Swan River as a floating art space was a testament to the people that I'd worked with. Absolutely a testament to them. Its final incarnation was as part of the inaugural Fremantle Biennale. It was no longer water worthy or water safe. So we moored it at the end of the Whalers Tunnel at the back of Bathers Beach, and we talked about the Biennale was framed around the idea of rising tides. So we talked about rising tides and the implications of rising tides. So we projected forward to 2100, and we knew that the anticipated sea level rise would mean that eventually raft would float if it sat there for long enough. So we started having conversations with the community coming by about the implications of that. So that was 30 odd people across a range of different backgrounds, from sailors to artists to climate scientists and so on, involved in Raft. The second one is a socially engaged project, which I developed with Elizabeth Pedler, who was one of the artists who was also involved in Raft. So I have an enduring fascination with apocalypses and the end of the world and the catastrophes we're bringing down on ourselves. So I created a project that I took to Know Thy Neighbour for their first iteration of, to Space, sorry, for their first iteration of Know Thy Neighbour, with the underlying premise of, or the underlying question of, if urban food supplies chains collapse, where do we get our food from? How do we survive? Because it takes time. I don't know if you saw people in Bunnings buying packets of carrots during COVID. It takes 3 to 6 months for a carrot to grow, and people were looking at it going, what? Seriously? Yes, it takes time for food to arrive, but our market-driven food supply chains don't support that. They support profit making, they don't necessarily support catastrophes. So the reality is, and COVID proved this, is it doesn't take much. 3 to 5 days for stuff to stop arriving on the shelves. So you go longer than that without fresh food arriving in the supermarket, how are you going to survive? Where are you going to get your food from? So Elizabeth and I developed this project through Know Thy Neighbour. Its first incarnations were as a series of food walks that came out of the research that we'd done about where would food come from. Foraging and edible weeds, Indigenous foods, First Nations foods, and also talking with First Nations folk. Dale Tilbrook led that particular tour about lived experience of food supply collapse. Because we've got it, that knowledge is here, it's present in our midst. When you talk about what does it look like culturally and socially when you disconnect people from their food, there's major implications for that. And then homeless folk, talking with homeless people about how they survive when they don't have a roof over their heads and they don't have access to the means to independently source and create their own food. So we relied on a whole lot of expertise that was outside of our field and building collaborations. From that initial incarnation, it then went to Disrupted Festival as a series of food walks, different time of the year, so different conversation, because food is seasonal. Weeds are seasonal. Please, pray God, you don't have or you don't experience food supply disruption here in Australia in summer, because we're all screwed, because there's no weeds around. There's no weeds, and all of the feral foods and the possible forage foods are in hibernation at that time, except for Indigenous foods. So we did a long table dinner, an apocalypse long table dinner where we fed people. That was Social Impact Festival. We did a long table dinner where we had conversations about what an apocalypse meal would look like while serving them. An apocalypse meal of edible weed salad, warrigal greens, retail stew, which Dale made, a whole bunch of different foods that we'd found and sourced the week before, and Disrupted Festival again. The food walks. So that's the evolution, I guess, in a really quick snapshot of how I've come to work collaboratively to extend my creative reach, if you like. You know, I can do a bit, sitting alone in a studio drawing stuff. I can do a whole lot more working with other people and allowing space for equity in that space, as opposed to me being the artist and dragging a whole bunch of people along with me. I can learn and grow from working with those people. So, about 8 years ago, I started to develop work around intergenerational queer connection. And it was particularly came from those early days of my art practice as a theatre and events technician. At that time, we were still in the thick of the AIDS pandemic, and the AIDS pandemic shaped my early queer life. I came out in 1985 as a 19-year-old at the time when AIDS was hitting mainstream media and was being talked about. For a year or so prior to that, it had been present and the conversations had been happening in queer media. It had finally surfaced and become visible to the mainstream community, and of course, what came from that was stigmatisation. It was the dirty three. It was IV drug users, gay men, and prostitutes, and there was a whole lot of moralising around a disease that really didn't moralise. It just took lives. And unlike COVID, so I've got a great reference point now, you've all been through COVID. Unlike COVID, if you contracted HIV in the early days of the pandemic, and when I say early days, we went through 3 years of COVID before, before they came up with a vaccine. The early days of HIV, 1983 to 1995, 12 years to find effective medications to suppress the disease. There is still no vaccine. There is still no effective way of stopping that disease in its tracks. And in those first 12 years, if you contracted the disease, 98% of people died. So the death rate from HIV was phenomenal. And in the end, it took the queer community and the IV drug users and the sex workers getting together, working collectively to pressure governments into action to keep us alive and well. And in fact, often we bypassed them and we just went ahead and did our own stuff to keep ourselves alive and well. So it informed my young queer life, and it still informs my older queer life. Because what I was seeing in 2018 or so, 6 years ago, was conversations as we were coming up to the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the declaration of the epidemic, as it was then known. I was seeing in queer media, on Reddit, in BuzzFeed posts, stories that talked about how catastrophic the HIV epidemic was and how we lost a generation to the epidemic. And I'm standing there going, still here, still here. There's a whole lot of people who are still here. The other thing was that I was talking with young queer folk. I was starting to build connections with young queer folk, and what I was hearing was stories about the epidemic that came from Sydney or Berlin or New York. They weren't about what it was like for us in place, in other places aside from those queer centres. And it's very easy when it's over there to distance yourself from it and not to feel connected. So I started making work that was about telling those stories, about bringing them out from where they were hidden away and connecting young queer folk to those stories, to those lived experiences. So I started working with, I can't remember if it was Performance Space in Sydney. I went and did their queer development program, and I started developing an artwork which was about reinventing a 90s queer party for a contemporary generation, which brought together older and younger people in the same space, and where I put my story front and centre as a kinky queer, genderqueer, previously IV drug using, at that time in the 90s, lesbian, and how my story was invisible, and how it's the importance of telling all those stories, the diversity of those stories, that empowers us and makes us strong. I was incredibly uncomfortable at the time standing up and telling my own story, but what I kept on being told was it's important for you to step up and tell that story. So what I'm learning is I'm good at talking. I'm still nervous. You can hear I'm still nervous, but all of your stories are important, and when we get together and we share them and we tell them collectively and we give them equal space and equal value to be honoured and cherished in that space, what you do is you build a really strong, really resourceful community. The queer communities are still very new. As publicly visible, coherent entities, we've really only existed in the white global north for about 60 years. We've existed for a lot longer than that, but you know, let's tell that story because that's the dominant story. So how do we take the experiences, the lived experiences of people who've gone through often quite damaging and traumatizing experiences and share those experiences with young people who are going through their own damaging and traumatizing experiences, different damaging and traumatizing experiences. How do we come together and we share those stories in a way that's meaningful? I keep looking at you, Colin, I'm sorry about that. How do we do that in a way that's meaningful for me to hear Colin's story, for example, and for Colin to hear mine? And for us to love and cherish and honour each other and share and support. So I created Transmission, took a couple of years. PICA supported me in 2020. It was 2020. It was January of 2020. I presented this artwork that was all about how do we talk about this extremely traumatizing experience for us collectively as a community and ensure that that knowledge gets passed forward. And the way that I did it was bring a whole bunch of people together and then ask them to transmit a kiss through the room. And that kiss was a promise to future generations to care and hold and support them. A month later, we were in a new pandemic. So I knew it was a prescient work. I just had no idea quite how prescient it was or how important it would be for my community to pull that story back out about HIV/AIDS and represent it to mainstream society and say, we've gone through this before. Please stop saying this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. For me, it's a twice-in-a-lifetime experience. And I already know what it's like, so I'm chilling along. So I'd created an artwork that I then couldn't perform. One of the arms that I'm talking about in terms of collaboration is institutional or organisational collaborations. I like to think of them as collaborations because in the end, and I'm going to badly paraphrase Charlton Heston, institutions is people. It's about connections with people in those institutions and about building longer term relationships than just project by project. So one of the things that I've been invested in over particularly this set of projects is wanting to build a creative career in a place that isn't a global art centre. So I'm not keen on flying. I've done a shitload of flying over my time and I feel I've got a huge carbon debt that I owe to young people, and that means stopping here, making a career here, and that means building relationships with institutions like PICA and Fremantle Arts Centre, who are very invested in artists like me who make work that doesn't easily sit on gallery walls. And so PICA have been particularly invested in supporting me to create this body of work. So during those 2 years of COVID, I'd already been asked to make work for Lawrence Wilson Art Gallery for their annual Here and Now exhibition, showcase of contemporary West Australian artists. And in 2020, they'd approached Brent Harrison, a young queer curator, to curate an exhibition of contemporary queer artists. And what I did was I was in the studio at PICA at the time because I wasn't able to further develop Transmission, but I already had studio time, and I said to them, can I just hang with my kin these people I'm building kinship relationships with and develop this work. So I developed a body work. This is about as high tech as I get, recording Zoom conversations. That's how technical and technically astute I am. So I created a body work that was about living a second time through an epidemic, through a pandemic. And then the next incarnation was, because I was building these relationships, not just with young queer folk, but also reconnecting with my older queer kin, was about taking the conversation to those two groups and saying, what if we lived in a world where our kinship ties weren't determined by biology and genetics? What would that look like? Create me an avatar of yourself in a world where you're connected to people differently or in other ways. And from that body of research, creative research, where I had a whole range of different people coming in and sitting down with me and creating avatars, I created 3 portraits. I call this the Queer Elders project. There's more to it. It'll eventually grow. But all 3 of these images are a portrait of 2 people. So what you have is, for example, you have Meredith's beautiful avatar as a sister of perpetual indulgence wearing Caro's avatar. So it's about a model of holding, supporting, nurturing, carrying younger generations. It was about, ultimately, the conversation that I was having with my peers and my predecessors about how do we nurture and care for our young generations, without necessarily speaking to conventional family relationships, but still addressing, you know, how are we parents and grandparents to those people? How are we aunties and uncles? How are we second cousins? Without necessarily using that naming, but understanding that we have obligations of relationality across generations. So this was from an elder's perspective. How do we build a model of eldership that nurtures and supports future generations? You had a question? Yeah.
I'm finding this really interesting. I was trying to work out how it relates to work that I do.
Yeah.
And it didn't click to me. I work with young Indigenous kids in the Pilgrim. We do digital environments so they can have language preservation and history and culture, and they can use that whole space.
Yeah.
And it was interesting what with this avatars, because we the tech developers do it in another country, and they had no idea on the Aboriginal child look. So when we got the avatars back, they had all those little pointy noses, and I said, no, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
These kids have got their own identities from the country they come from, their facial features, their own distinction as Aboriginal people.
Absolutely.
And that was a big question mark for me.
And it's really important, and I think you and I are going to have good conversations. For me, it was really important to, in building this set of creative narratives and storytelling, was that I start to investigate what queer culture is and how it gets played out. So that comment that I made earlier, just because I'm dancing doesn't mean I'm not angry, that was my lived experience of being on parade routes, was that one thing queer folk were really brilliant at was creating costumes from nothing at all and going out and performing on the streets. And I think that that's the really important part for you around Indigenous culture, is honouring your culture and your people first.
One of the avatars that we got back in the girls was a short shorts. And I said, no, that's not going to fly in their communities. They've got to be, you know, have to be dressed appropriately.
Yes, so I don't know what the answer is. And it's part of what I'm going to come back to.
It's interesting because, I was trying to work out how do we...
Yeah, because you've got to work with those...
culturise the identity of the avatar.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is what I'm going to speak to a little bit about the Hyper Local Residency, is that because I don't know how to work with this tech myself. I'm really dependent on the relationships that I have with other people, and part of that means actually engaging with them in a way that encourages them to learn more and know more about queer folk and queer culture, and not just gay pride, but also gay grief, queer grief and queer rage, you know, and understanding where those come from and respecting them and giving them space to be expressed as well. And I'm still working it out. I'm still working out how do I work with organisations and institutions, how do I work with creative collaborators who aren't queer, how do I work with technicians and mentors who aren't queer, and get them on side. So that was kind of what I was talking about, working collaboratively, is how do I build bridges without burning myself out, doing all that labour, all of that mental and emotional labour to bring those people on side. My history in queer activism and in theatre plays into that, I think. I don't have the answers. What I'm doing is trying to work out a way to practice that puts my community and my investment in my community front and centre, and brings everyone else along with that to ensure that those stories are appropriately told and honoured and respected. So I don't know how to get people in a different country to understand or respond. So I'd love to keep talking with you. Yeah, I totally get it. Yeah. Yep.
About keeping that identity and
Yeah.
making that unique and
Yep. And those,
knowing where you belong in the, you know.
yeah, those diverse minority voices often get rendered invisible or only partially heard, or they get co-opted, and we can do better. We can do better than that, and I think it's about developing a way of practicing that that is collective and collaborative, and that offers space for that, because I do think that the great opportunity here is for me as a queer person and for you as a First Nation person to talk across shared experiences, but also talk about those cultural differences and how we might be able to share those experiences. It's really important to me. I just think, you know, we're...
I just think things that you're saying is very important and very relevant, and how
Great.
can we
Yeah.
spread and share those experiences and
Love it.
share it,
Yeah, because it's becoming an increasingly homogenised and universalised world, even in the queer world. So please don't ever tell me Pride parades and Mardi Gras parades are not political. You can just go fuck yourselves. That is so not true. That is so not true. And if you use that to try and keep me off the parade route, you're in for a whole heap of trouble, because just being visible in its own right is a political moment. I can't help being visible. I couldn't help being visible and being targeted when I was a young queer person because I was just being myself. What it did do, though, was it eventually made me go, look, playing nicely doesn't get me anywhere. I'm still being targeted and I'm still being victimised, so what's the other side of that coin? I just go out there and I be myself, and I be myself in collaboration with a whole lot of other queer folk, and we take over the streets one night a year. One night a year. One night a year. Fuck. I'm around for the other 364. Why do I only get one night a year? Anyway, please don't tell me those moments aren't political and they aren't strategic, because they are, and they're all about the power of performance and art to change the world. And I think that's really potent. So anyway, that's me. Believe it or not, that's a welding jacket. That's my very first welding jacket, painted hot pink. From following on from that, so I'd created Transmission, I'd created a body of work about the intimate relationships that I had with queer kin who I couldn't be physically in the same space with during COVID, and I'd created work around eldership and creating models of eldership. But I'm constantly looking for ways to expand that conversation, to grow that conversation with both my generation, my predecessors, and young queer folk. And one of the ideas I'd had for a long time was around the ubiquity of what I call white men on horseback, public artworks that celebrate a particular model of culture and history, and wanting to create queer monuments, public artworks that celebrate queer folk, but wanting them to have a particular characteristic. I wanted them to be invisible. And if you know, you know moment. And I couldn't work out how to do that. And it wasn't until I saw a bunch of people running down the road with their phones in front of them, and I discovered Pokemon Go, that I realised it was possible. That technology was advancing in a way that it was possible to use augmented reality, extended reality, and immersive artworks to be able to create queer monuments that were invisible until you stuck your phone up in front of your face, and all of a sudden you had a gateway or a portal to a different world, and you could see a different world. It was a queer world. It was filled with colour and movement, because white men on horseback. But the biggest hindrance, the biggest stumbling block was that I didn't know how to use that technology. I just couldn't see how to move it forward. So for a couple of years it went nowhere, and I focused on these other artworks. And then PICA, bless them, put out a call out for artists to be involved in what they called the XR, Extended Reality Boot Camp. And I went, fuck yeah, I'm in there. So I presented this idea. I said I wanted to create augmented reality virtual monuments for queer folk. And they took me up on it. And I got to spend 2 days following on from the boot camp, 2 days immersed in a studio with, I think, 3 or 4 other artists who were supported by creatives and technicians and mentors in that virtual domain. And this was the outcome. Over 2 days, was working with Natalie Mourinho and Gabe Ibias in the studio at PICA over an intensive weekend, and I got to create my hot pink dyke on a bike celebration of early Pride parades. So we were able to locate this by putting a QR code outside the museum here, opposite the Pride Hotel at the start of the original Pride parades. And there's a whole lot of embedded symbolism and language in those monuments that we don't use anymore in queer culture that I want to pull back in and say it's not just rainbow flags, folks. There's a whole lot of other visual cues and symbols that we used to use to find each other and connect with each other. So that got me fired up, and then it stopped in its tracks, because I still don't know how to use that technology. But this was back in 2021, so 4 years ago. I was entirely dependent on technicians and expertise to be able to create these. I could bring my ideas in, but I couldn't have any hands-on input. And one of the things that I do know when I'm making art is that my creative brain gets fired up when my hands are doing stuff, when I'm making things and I'm involved. So making artwork at a distance on a computer screen through a technician just was really hard for me creatively. So following on from that though, because I'd built these wonderful relationships with my mentor, Natalie, and the artist technician, Gabe Ibias, I was approached by the WA AIDS Council, coming up to the 40th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic, to create an addition to the monument. So I don't know if you've ever seen the memorial. No one knows it's there. It looks like any war memorial. It was a team of, they weren't on horseback, but they were straight white men. And it's a fountain of remembrance, but there's nothing about it that talks about the queer experience. So folks at the community at WA AIDS Council knew I was building this series of projects about queer kinship, and they said, can you create an addition to the memorial that actually addresses the queer experience? And they wanted a sculptural element, and I said, I'll do the sculptural element if you'll let me do an augmented reality element as well. So what they got was, they got a human scale remembrance ribbon, and it has 3 butterflies on it. And then there's a QR code right at the front. And Gabe and Natalie helped me create.
So where is it?
Oh, it's on the corner of Robertson Road and Fitzgerald Street.
True.
Yeah, so there's a great cafe next door. Everyone knows the cafe, no one knows the memorial. It's been there for 40 years. It's been there for 40 years. 30 years, sorry. 10th anniversary of the epidemic was when they created this. So I chose the butterfly because of my involvement in Mardi Gras, early days of Mardi Gras, Gay Liberation Front. Their symbol was the butterfly. And the reason why it was the butterfly was emerging from the chrysalis, coming out. And you'll still see, to this day, highly stylised representations of the butterfly in the Mardi Gras posters and in their promotional stuff. I wanted to reclaim it because of that connection to early symbols that weren't rainbow flags. Fucking rainbow flags. But I also wanted to use butterflies because they talk to, across cultures, butterflies are used in conversations about death, dying and the afterlife. And I wanted to honour every single person who had died here in Perth during the epidemic. I know I'm running over. Yep. All right, super quickly. That then comes to Hyper Local Residency. So the technology's moved. It's advanced so quickly in 3 years that it's actually now at a point where it's accessible to me. Oh, by the way, every single one of these projects that I've shown you, unfunded, aside from tiny amounts of money, unfunded. So $1,000 here, $3,000 there. Hyperlocal, again, primarily unfunded. I got some arts impact funding and it paid for me to be in the studio for 2 days, but it didn't pay for anyone to help me or support me. But fortunately, I have lovely friends these days who did help and support me. I was able to create maquettes and I was able to use photogrammetry. So I was able to use my mobile phone, 3D scan the maquettes and then put them out into the world. Not particularly well. I still don't know what I'm doing, but I'm getting better and the technology is getting better and more accessible. Where to from here? I have no idea because I still don't have any money. What I do have though is a great network of collaborators and that's it. And we're out of time, I think.
Woo! Yeah.